Hey everybody, TacticAngel back on the PlayStation 5 to take a look at another premium ship in World of Warships Legends. This time we'll be looking at the Tokachi, a Tier 6 premium Japanese light cruiser. For this review, we'll start with some history, discuss the ship in game, commanders, stats, and finish off with some gameplay, but check out the time codes in the description if you want to jump around at all. As far as history of this ship goes, we would have to start with the Furitaka. This would be Japan's first foray into what would eventually be known as a heavy cruiser, though at the time, Japan referred to it as a medium cruiser, which isn't that bad of a name for a ship that sits halfway between light cruiser and battle cruiser. These were originally drawn up as the A class. Following the design developments that, at this point, Japan had no reason to think weren't successful, the intended 3 ships of the A class would feature an all-welded hull with the actual armor serving as the structural support of the ship rather than simply being fastened to it. She would borrow the Yubari's undulating hull shape, but eliminate the forecastle for a flush deck design. Both of these decisions were in service of saving weight and allowing for the ships to meet an impressive intended 35 knots. She'd be armored enough to withstand fire from 6-inch shells, but sport 20-centimeter guns, basically 8 inches, which in retrospect we consider a heavy cruiser. And though she was a heavy cruiser, she was designed to defeat the Omaha-class light cruisers of the US Navy, both in speed and lethality. Though not specifically contemplated as a treaty-era cruiser, the designed 7,100 tons would have been well within the treaty limits, even after the ships came in around 900 tons too heavy. Granted, between shifting priorities and learnings during the construction process, the third of the initial ship order was spun off into a new class, instead favoring 3 twin turrets in a traditional 2 forward and 1 aft configuration. That third ship was the Aoba, and she would get a full sister in the Kunigasa. The description in game hints at the fate of the Furitakas. Between 1936 and 1939, the Furitakas were both rebuilt and effectively became sisters, or at least half-sisters, to Aoba, with 3 twin turrets of 20-centimeter guns, etc., etc. Again, the description in-game contemplates that rather than rebuild this as another heavy cruiser, instead foresaw the obsolescence of both the Furitaka class as a heavy cruiser and the dawn of the coming supremacy of carrier aviation in naval combat. We have to imagine there is at least some indication that they'd be aware of that, maybe more than any other nation, but maybe they had competing priorities and underestimated just by how much America could outbuild the Empire of Japan by the end of the war. In fact, Japan started to consider converting some cruisers, starting with the Tenryu class in 1936, the same year that is also listed in-game for the Tokachi. There was a second review even in 1938 alongside the Kuma. During the war, it was also contemplated for the Ioda, Suzuya, and Kumano, but never the Furitaka class. To take you back to the beginning, I hinted that the Yubari design principles didn't quite work out. The Furitakas ended up with familiar shortcomings of interwar Japanese ship design. She was top-heavy, her hull was not strong enough, and was vulnerable to the twisting forces of the ocean. And being too heavy, she ended up sitting lower in the water than intended, making her quite a wet boat, and also slower than designed. Near as I can tell, there are a few reasons why this ship didn't exist. For one, the Aoba designs probably didn't seem that far out of date at the time, and it was at least a near peer to the York class of ships operated by the British Empire, and the removal of the fly-off platform in favor of a proper catapult between 1932 and 1933 at least indicated that the Imperial Japanese Navy were still contemplating this in its original purpose as a sort of scout cruiser. After all, the ships they were intended to defeat were still in service, and in particular in the South Pacific. That does mean that the model we have in-game for the Furitaka is probably best understood as an interwar design from between 1932 and 1936, before the more significant rebuild of the ship. In any case, it's also safe to say that with the Washington Naval Treaty, their shortage of AA seemed smaller than their shortage of big gun ships, since the treaty ended so many battleship and battlecruiser projects then in flight. Another consideration is that Furitaka had 6 semi-turrets, basically enclosed but not necessarily armored structures, to help you from having to load a gun outside. Though two 12.7cm guns would weigh less than a single 20cm gun, it's not real apparent that once you enclose them in a full turret and add all of the machinery necessary to operate them, that you don't still end up with a ship that wants to drown its own crew, and that is before you consider throwing an extra 6 Type 93 torpedoes on deck, which is a casual 18 tons stored above the waterline for anyone wondering. Also, a bit of editorializing, but if I were making an AA cruiser designed in 1936, I'd ditch the plane, whose catapult is going to be in one of your turret's firing arcs, in favor of using its hangar space for more 40mm guns. The other reason this wasn't built, which isn't speculation, was the Japanese were always short on these 12.7cm guns. It's actually one of the reasons none of the other ships mentioned previously were converted into AA cruisers. And the final reason may be, from a pedantic point of view, there was no cruiser named Tokachi in the Japanese Navy during World War II. Furutaka began the tradition of naming heavy cruisers after mountains, or rather, her actual sister ship did, Kako, when she was laid down first, but finished second. Similarly though, Tokachi is the name of a volcanic mountain in the Hokkaido region of Japan, so it is at least in keeping with the naming conventions. So what does all this mean for not exactly the only AA cruiser that Japan never considered building? The comparisons to Atlanta and Flint are almost unavoidable, though the truth is she probably plays closest to the Pan-Asian light cruisers that we have in game. That's due in large part to having a capable torpedo armament. You don't have many of them, but they have good damage and good range. And you also come with more than a few reload boosters. You'll also have to consider using them in order to get the most out of this ship. She's a capable island camper, as you would expect, if we're comparing it to US light cruisers. That means very high arcs that make finding an island to park behind relatively easy, and the speed of Japanese cruisers allows you to get from one to another a lot faster than you can do in similar boats. While this may seem like I've lost my mind, the Tokachi carries all of its protection on the outside, at least among ships that play more or less like this. She's actually got enough armor that she can repel battleship shots and not simply pray for those overpens. Also, due to the disappointing way that you have to obtain this ship, there's a good chance that battleship players aren't going to realize this, view you as free XP, and aim center belt. But the reason why some of you may think I've lost my mind with that is because if, for whatever reason, this goes wrong, Tokachi has a very prominent citadel that can take you from an admittedly fiery cherry blossom to a death blossom in as little as 2 shells. Some might say you're a bit of a paper tiger too, because you certainly have all the trappings of an AA cruiser, and unless your qualifications are as simple as is cruiser and has AA, Tokachi probably actually wouldn't qualify. It's also notable, particularly with the high price of this ship, that it's arguably the least capable version of an ultralight cruiser that you could buy. Trying to incorporate torpedoes in this kind of gameplay is going to feel unnatural to a lot of players, and it may just be viewed as less useful than having radar or smoke to everyone else. Ultimately, this makes Tokachi a bit like Flint and Atlanta at home, as long as that home is mid-20th century Japan, which is a place not well known for having particularly effective AA. Where it probably does satisfy those folks who are into the whole super light cruiser gameplay is the ability to hang in there a little bit more than the other ships, while being able to really scoot around the battlefield when you need to, and then also being capable of flinging normal torpedoes and at quite good ranges. In short, this ship is hard to get, and that might be fitting, because this ship is, even more than most, not going to be for everyone. And as we jump into commanders, we'll be starting with the base commander, Togo. There's nothing particularly wrong with running around with him. Tokachi is fast, reasonably stealthy, and a good fire starter. Togo offers you the ability to better do all of those things. If you want a little more maneuverability or extra range, there's opportunities there, but there's nothing wrong with fully packed if you're happy enough with just one more consumable. But none of these choices are particularly interesting, are they? Matsuji Ijuin is really going to be the choice for people who want to get the most out of those torpedoes. There's an argument to be made that with just 2 racks of 3, this is investing a lot into a very small part of the overall Tokachi package. But he does come with the ability to increase fire chance, stealth, and speed, while confidently being able to devote 3 other skills to those fish. Plus, you get a bit of help from his base trait. In any case, if you want the more traditional relationship found between high damage, high range torpedoes, and low visibility on a Japanese cruiser, he's the one that can most connect you with that relationship, regardless of how valuable it is. You could make the argument that Tokachi meets most of the requirements for playing an agile cruiser. You're pretty fast, you have an acceptable turning circle, and certainly the rudder shift you can get with Mikawa can make dodging at range always a possibility. The 360 turrets will always keep your guns more or less faced where they're meant to be, but this does seem like a high-stakes game of poker, and Lord knows it's hard enough to hit anything at the ranges where agile cruisers can play without the violent sort of maneuvering and slow shell velocity that you get with this ship. Maybe that's your thing. That said, you can always fall back on Mikawa for just making this thing that much faster and slightly more survivable. But whatever you do, he offers you pretty much nothing in the way of offense. Yamamoto is going to be the commander for the person who looks at Tokachi and immediately smiles, thinking about how you have 12 fast-firing 5-inch guns. The extra range he gives you is probably mostly useful against farming AFK players, given the flight times involved, even at normal ranges, and there's an argument to be made against accuracy when those flight times are so long. Probably the best reason to use him is for that up to 5% better fire chance, which pairs nicely with the improved rate of fire you can get. This is the closest that you're going to get to the full Japanese Atlanta experience, as long as you don't notice anybody flying planes over you. And as we come to stats, if you've been listening so far, you probably won't be surprised to hear things like Atlanta or Flint several times, so let's just get through this. Survivability. Well, this is built off of a tier 4 hull, so it might not be surprising that you don't have a lot of HP. 32,000 is about 10% less than most cruisers, but among the super lights, it's actually more like 5,000 more than what you would expect. The armor is also a bit different. Rather than a small, low citadel wrapped in paper mache and hope, you've got a very prominent citadel with 76 millimeters of armor on your belt. That means that you can't go broadside at short distances and just expect everything to overpen you like in Atlanta, but it does mean that with the right angle, you can actually bounce quite a lot of shots. And that's probably an advantage that you'll be able to hold on to against all but the most knowledgeable opponents, since looking at this, you'd just assume it crumples like a piece of paper. And there's probably not going to be enough of them out there for a lot of people to immediately realize that trick. As far as Tokachi's main battery, she comes with a dozen 5-inch guns in 6 turrets. They're arranged 3 forward and 3 to the rear. The arrangement limits the maximum number that you can fire directly forward or to the rear. And that gives a little less DPS than you'd expect in some fire arcs, but it does also encourage you not to sit bow onto things. A subtle hint that will help you, maybe even accidentally, play to this ship's armor scheme. Turret rotation is a very snappy 7.2, same as Atlanta, but they're also 360 turrets, all of them following the design principle that if you're gonna make something up, why not make it convenient? The firing angles themselves are better than you'd expect, and the number of guns that you can get onto target will help you figure out if you're presenting a bounce angle to your enemy or if you're in serious danger. Flight times are different. If you're missing all your shots, it's not because you're drunk, or at least it's not specifically because you're drunk. The travel times here are similar to Atlanta or Flint, which makes hitting ships at range, particularly if they're smaller or doing kind of any maneuvering at all, pretty challenging. The 127mm caliber means that there's a lot of armor that you're just going to shatter off of with HE, so these are mostly there for shooting superstructures on battleships for damage. They work pretty fine against destroyers, and landing shots on anything will help you overall with damage over time. The 2150 damage and quick 7-second reload makes for very good damage over time, same with the 9% fire chance. That basically means that these are individually punchier shots than American 5-inch guns, but with a slower reload. The AP is largely the same idea, but is similarly only really useful at very lightly armored cruisers at ranges where you probably don't want to be. As for the other part of your arsenal, torpedoes, you have one triple launcher on each side of the ship. The torpedoes do the standard 17,233 damage that you'll find on most Japanese cruisers. That's reasonably punchy on a per torpedo basis, but the total of 6 is not a lot. They are pretty fast at 70 knots, and they match that with an incredible 12 km range. Currently the joint longest range for a cruiser at tier 6. The low number of torpedoes and 70-second reload means that these have a deceptively low torpedo DPM, but you do have a trick to fix that we'll talk about later. Here's the AA at home section. If you think that the 55 rating means anything, then this is about 2 points behind the average cruiser at the tier. Almost all of that rating is due to the 71 points of damage that you put out there at 4.5 to 5 kilometers. Functionally, that's all of your AA that really matters. You have an extra 21 points of DPS at short range. There have been grocery stores in LA that I'm pretty sure had better short range AA for short periods of time. That all combines for a pretty miserable 92 damage per second, just under half the average cruiser, and a casual 130 DPS less than Flint. This is helped somewhat by consumables, but tripling your AA doesn't exactly make this thing all that fierce, and certainly not for all that long. Tokachi picks up some advantages in the realm of maneuverability. At 34.5 knots, she's typically fast, which is what you'd expect in a Japanese cruiser. That probably doesn't help her turning circle, which is a bit wide at 750 meters, and she comes with an 8.8 second rudder, which is statistically average. Overall, pretty okay. When we look at concealment, this is a strong point for Tokachi. She's got about a half-kilometer advantage over most cruisers, which includes the Atlantas. That turns into a slightly lesser 300-meter advantage from the air, and you can fire and smoke as close as 4.9 kilometers before being seen, which is the shortest range, second only to Furukyou, which many of you have probably forgot is a ship that exists in the game. Coming to consumables, there's not a ton to talk about here. You get your typical cruiser damage control. The only reason your sonar is notable is that it has an almost meaningless difference than you get on something like Miyoko. I was sort of curious if this thing would end up with Furutaka sonar. It's not, though it is 200 meters less range than Miyoko, and has 10% more action time. After that, you have the only really interesting consumable to have, a torpedo reload booster. This effectively resets your torpedo reload to 6 seconds, followed by a lengthy 3-minute recharge. It's worth mentioning that you get 3 of these, and that the games are only 15 minutes long, so covetously holding onto these is probably not really necessary, but throwing them away without considering your fate in the next 2 minutes is also not a great idea either. Then you have a choice between 2 consumables that will let you down in similar fashion. You can stick with the catapult fighter, and you might have a consumable that will shoot down 1 attacking aircraft. Sometimes. You can exchange that for defensive AA fire, which increases your DPS to not embarrassing levels, though it's still not very strong. And don't get me wrong, DFAA is the better option. It's just neither of these work all that well on this ship. Alright, and as we come to gameplay, we're going to be on Trident. Looks like I'll be starting out on the east flank. As we get the game going, I'll go ahead and put my commander up on the screen pretty quickly. I don't have a strong feeling about how you actually should run this ship. But, I mean, it all seems to more or less work, and it's really what you want out of the ship. I personally am going for guns in this case. I never have found that guns hurt. I mean, unless you're on the receiving end, but like in this ship in particular. But I guess what I mean is fires. Obviously, you can lean into torpedoes if you really want to. You don't have that many. I go ahead, put all of mine out kind of at the beginning of the match. That corner is kind of where everybody drives. If you're a destroyer, you drive there. If you're a cruiser and you don't try to post up on that inner island, you drive there. And you can see in the background, we got a Russian battleship that's also driving there. I don't mind getting spotted a little bit here because I'm kind of hoping that the Russian battleship, the Ismail, I guess, turns a little bit more back in. Wouldn't mind hitting somebody with a torpedo, and since they come with such incredible range, we would certainly have the opportunity if he didn't turn all the way out. We did get a little bit of reconnaissance by damage there, though, because we did hit somebody, and it was nobody we could see. So there is an unhappy destroyer there. There are 3 options on the enemy team. So I go ahead, start up my sonar in hopes of hopefully picking him out before I have to round the corner. If I can do that, maybe somebody else can shoot him. And here we have some incoming shots from one of the cruisers in the back. It looks like his line of sight is going to run out and leave the Moss at just about 0 hit points. So, you know, you only live once. You know, I'm not really sure why that's a motto that people tell themselves before they convince themselves to do something pretty silly, but here we go. We do close the distance, finally get some shells over those rocks. And now we're heading out towards the Leander. It looks like the Leander just turned around, so he probably doesn't have all that many guns that can actually shoot me. We're in kind of a place we don't want to be, so for a second here, I'm going to let myself lose this spot to try to get a better angle. Just so if the Ismail does decide to shoot me, I'm a little bit better angled. And now that we're at a 45, we at least have a little bit of time to kind of turn our ship if he does decide to actually target us. You can see there, I've gone for a shot on his bow. That is largely because he was on fire in the mid section of his ship, and we wanted to get that going again. It looks like he's playing a survivability build, which means it's going to be harder to dodge him because he's not going to have that specifically accurate of aim. He does get us several times there. He takes out all our AA, which is not a huge problem in this game. But even if he was shooting AP, there's a pretty good chance that I bounce several of those shots. Pretty much everything that lands below the deck line. I'd still take some damage, obviously, to the superstructure. And now I'm starting to worry about yet more ships that might have opportune angles against my little cruiser with terrible armor. We're switching over to AP here just to see if we can't chunk the side of New Orleans. We're probably a little bit too far away and he's got too much time to dodge. So we're back to the HE. Realistically speaking, if you sit on HE in this ship, it's not that terrible of an idea because this definitely does fit the HE spammer lifestyle. Kind of hoping Ismail dies before he gets another opportunity to shoot me. He does. We've got a Miyoko. I would say that that's a ship that you don't typically want to go in aggressively jousting with other cruisers with, but then again, I'm in no position to really talk about that. We get our torpedoes out there and immediately go ahead and get our torpedo reload going. At this range, the widespreads aren't the worst idea ever, just because they're a little bit harder to dodge if the person is fully broadside to you. And thanks to the torpedo angles on the ship, we actually do manage to finish him off. Now, all of this is to say that none of what you're seeing in this game is really what this ship is particularly designed to do. Usually what you do is you find a nice island and you try to sit behind it. And you lob shells over it, and I could show you 15 minutes of that kind of gameplay, and it is exactly what you would expect. In this case, we're doing slightly more interesting things, which is getting into it. You can see a little bit of the survivability with that improved armor versus some other super light cruisers that you might expect to just get torn up in these kind of close engagements. And then obviously what you see going on right now is that there's a destroyer trying to fight a light cruiser with 12 fast-firing guns. Now, I make a curious call here, and that is that I don't think that I'm going to be able to stop in time. So what I decide to do is throw on the gas and turn out, knowing that I'll take a torpedo, but hoping that I get the cap in time. Now, both of the things that I thought would happen happened, and I don't know if I had chose a different path, if I would have successfully dodged. But that at least puts our team in a reasonably good position to try to hunt down the rest of the ships on the enemy team. Here you can see a little bit of that going on. I'm not sure if I could have stopped, but it really didn't matter. We were just showing off what this little ship can do. It obviously starts lots of fires. It's reasonably fast. You've got the torpedo reload, and if you want to make that happen, you can make it happen, even with a small number of them. So that is going to get us all the way to closing thoughts on Tokachi. Well, this one comes to you in the worst kind of way to get a ship, but thankfully you're not really missing all that much. For the most part, the thing this ship can do can be done in an Atlanta or a Flint for cheaper and arguably safer, or with more utility, or even Champagne. If you do get it, there's nothing particularly wrong with it. The torpedo trick is certainly stronger on this ship than on the American versions. I think you could probably make an argument for Champagne either way, but this ship does do that a little bit at the expense of perhaps DPM fires or even AA. It's a relatively familiar idea, this time with the Japanese wrapping, that can surprisingly be a bit more survivable, but that's really subject to your own skill, awareness, and of course, a good amount of luck. In any case, those are just my thoughts on Tokachi. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments, and as always, I'll see you on the next one.